There we go. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the December 2024 Forest Connect webinar series. I'm pleased that you're able to join us. And as those of you who've been here before, you know that I'm often fortunate to have really incredible guests and presenters come talk about some very interesting current topics that are relevant to the forestry world. Today's no different. We're joined by Dr. Alexandra Kosiba, goes by Ali. She's a forest ecologist and extension associate professor at the University of Vermont, where she leads their extension forestry program. University of Vermont was without an extension forester for many years, so I was excited as a neighbor to learn of Ali joining there not too long ago, a couple of years ago. I've seen some webinars that she gave on forest carbon. Her specialty, as you'll see here, is deals with carbon storage and carbon sequestration. She's an excellent presenter. She has some great um, publications that she's written and are publicly available. What she works on is to create resources and conducts applied research to help landowners, foresters, policymakers, and the public through New England and New York make decisions about how climate change and other stressors impact the forest. Today, Sally's going to be talking about forest soils. And in all of the years, I don't think we've ever had a dedicated forest soils webinar. So this is great. And Ali, I'm going to turn off my video and mute, and it's all to you. Thanks for joining us.
Great. Thanks, Peter. Thanks for inviting me. And thanks everyone for joining today at noon and maybe your lunch break. Maybe you're eating lunch, totally fine. That's great. I'm glad you're here. So yeah, as Peter said, I'm going to talk about forest soils, carbon, and climate change. I'm going to turn off my video just so I'm not distracting and you'll hear me speak. And slides are looking good unless I hear otherwise from Peter. And we will have time at the end for questions. So save those questions. You can put them in the chat. All right. So talking about forest soils, why are forest soils important? Well, they provide a vital space for roots to grow. They are critical for nutrient cycling. So this is where trees and other organisms in the forest get important nutrients like nitrogen, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and they are key for water storage. So all those pore spaces within the soil structure are critical for storing water and for allowing organisms to access that water. They're also home to a biodiverse suite of organisms we call the soil biota. They provide vital functions to break down and decompose organic matter. So without soil biota, dead matter would accumulate, nutrients would be inaccessible to plants and other organisms. And so we have these two sort of groups of soil biota. The top you can see are these microbes, very small organisms. That's bacteria, fungi, protists, which are things like amoeba, and viruses exist. So all of these are, sort of microscopic organisms that we have in our soil. We also have larger organisms we call soil fauna. So earthworms are probably something you'll think about, but snails, slugs, spiders, millipedes, nematodes, mites, those all reside in that soil or on the surface of the soil in dead organic matter. More than half of the world's species live in soil. This is really cool research that came out just last year, looking at soil and all the organisms that live in soil. And these are some photos and examples of the range of organisms that live in soil. And that's a pretty incredible statistic to see that we often, don't think about what's under our feet when we walk in the woods. I'm very biased. I love trees and look at trees, but a lot is going on under our feet, and it's really critical and important. More recently, soils have gained attention because they are a critical component of the global carbon cycle. So they play a major role in regulating the Earth's climate through their ability to accumulate and store carbon. They're actually the largest land-based carbon pool on Earth, which is pretty cool. And they store, somewhere around 4 to 6 times more carbon than all plant biomass combined. So given that vast size of this carbon pool, there are concerns that any changes to the amount of carbon stored in the soil could significantly impact atmospheric carbon dioxide. And another cool thing about carbon in soils is it can reside there for a very long amount of time. I will say, though, not all carbon is stored for long amounts of time. It varies from, hours, days, weeks, months, but it can reside for millennia. And you'll see in this figure of the globe, different colors denoting length of carbon residency, and that's in the top 3% 3 feet of soil. And so it really does matter how deep in the soil profile you go. But you can see if you zoom into where we are, it's, sort of greenish, yellowish. And so there can be carbon that is 1,000, 2,000 years old, which is pretty cool to think about and reflect from where that carbon came from. Here in our neck of the woods in the Northeast, so I consider the region I mostly talk about is the New England states, and then New York is sort of the geographic range I work in mostly. About 50% of the carbon in our forest is stored in the soil. And this, you'll see on the left, we divide the forest and its carbon into these reservoirs or pools. They are really intimately connected. So it's really hard to draw strict lines because carbon moves from different parts of the forest into other parts. So carbon moves into the soil from live trees. When trees lose leaves in the fall, or needles from conifer trees get cycled through, roots turn over at different amounts of time and become decomposed and part of that soil profile. Of course, when trees die or logs fall to the ground, that wood decomposes and some of that carbon gets incorporated into the soil. When we look at the proportions on the right, so this is the average amount of carbon stored in New England and New York forests, you can see, and this is real data from our forests, more than half of it is stored in that soil, that brown part of that pie chart, which is pretty incredible. However, when we look at accumulation, so we use this often, the word is sequestration here, or flux. So this is the rate that carbon gets accumulated in these different reservoirs or pools. We see the brown part of the pie chart is very small. And what is this is showing is that soils in our neck of the woods do not accumulate carbon very quickly. They're sort of stable in that they store a massive amount. Carbon inputs are put into that soil, but there's also emissions and losses of carbon from a lot of natural processes. And I'll talk about what those are, but just the gist here is that soil pool does not accumulate very quickly. And that's compared to the green parts of this pie chart, right? Is a above ground live biomass. That's the tree parts we can see. Most of that carbon accumulation every year is happening there, and a lot is happening below ground in the roots. And then in that gray part of the pie chart, which is deadwood, we're accumulating more deadwood every year. How does carbon get stored in the soil? Well, it can originate from two main sources, inorganic carbon and organic carbon. And I won't get too much into, chemistry here, but just to talk about these two types, because I think it's kind of interesting. So inorganic carbon is weathering of rocks or soil minerals when they react with carbon dioxide. And that largely occurs as carbonate minerals. So you think of limestone, and that creates this carbon in the soil. We also have carbon that originates from living things, from remains of plants or organisms, animals, wastes, and exudates, which are carbon compounds that are released by some living organisms, namely tree and plant roots and fungi. And so inorganic carbon is more common. It's a primary source of soil carbon in arid regions with sparse vegetation, so desert-like systems, tundras. When we see organic carbon is our primary source of carbon in our forests here in the Northeast. We do have inorganic carbon from limestone, things like that, but it gets processed really quickly and doesn't last very long because of our conditions in this neck of the woods. So soil organic carbon is what we call that that organic carbon pool really comes from dead plants and animals. There's sort of three big buckets of origin. So plant carbon, detritus, that's just a word for plant parts that are shed. So leaves, broken branches, roots that break off or are no longer needed. Trees and plants cycle through roots pretty quickly, especially those really fine roots. Leachates, so that's liquids that originate from those plants when they start decomposing. So it's soluble carbon. And I mentioned root exudates. There's also microbial carbon. Again, detritus, when microbes die, their bodies are still in the soil or on the soil surface. They also secrete enzymes and mucilage, into the soil. And so those are also sources of carbon. There's also macroinvertebrate carbon, so things like worm casting you might be familiar with, but also any exoskeletons from insects, frass, which is just really their waste, that's all incorporated into the soil. Soil biota decompose these organic carbon inputs. So how this happens is those microbes in the soil, they break down plant and animal matter into smaller pieces. That's then consumed and excreted by soil fauna. So things like earthworms, millipedes, and snails will eat that and break it down further. So as that soil biota community continues to consume the organic matter, the carbon compounds are transported to deeper depths, and they're actually broken down into smaller and smaller components. When the soil biota die, they are also contributing to that organic carbon pool. And so it is really this, very complex thing that's happening in our soil to get carbon into our soil, especially when we think about how deep our soil is in some places, that carbon can be transported fairly deep in the soil profile. And this is what a soil profile looks like, an example of one. So we, have these layers of different types of soil. And this is just an example of one. It really depends on the bedrock, the history of that site, whether there were glaciers at that location, whether there were old rivers or lakes or ponds, and also the vegetation that exists there. But this just shows when we talk about these soil layers or horizons that we can have these different profiles in the soil. And so the stability and longevity of the carbon in our soil really depends on this microbial community and if that carbon binds to soil minerals and also how deep in that soil profile the carbon gets transported. So organic carbon in our soil, that soil organic carbon component can exist as particles of plants and animals in various stages of decay. So you think about the forest floor layer, right? You have leaves, you can tell where they came from, what species they are. You have twigs. As you pull back that top layer into that organic horizon, you can't really, it's smaller and smaller pieces of plant material. You usually can't tell where it originated from. You go deeper and deeper, and these carbon components from biomass, are smaller and in different stages of decay. You can also have that soil organic carbon exist dissolved in water. And this is a really important part of our forests and our aquatic areas adjacent to forest. And it is I'll talk about this later. As we experience more heavy rain events, there is a potential for us to have more carbon dissolved in water when we have more water in our forests. And then we also have carbon that is chemically bound to soil minerals. This last form of carbon is the most stable. That's the one that when we looked at that map of carbon that can persist for, millennia, this is how it exists. It has to be chemically bound to minerals in the soil, and that's usually deeper in those soil horizons in this image. It's important to note, though, this really varies by site and soil type. So some soil types, if you think of clay soils, they actually really are good at binding carbon. That's just because of their chemical properties. They're better at binding carbon compared to sandy soils. And then across all soil types, the deeper in the soil the carbon is stored, the longer it can remain and the more stable it is. And this is really important when we think about strategies we can take to protect soil carbon. Depending on the site, carbon can accumulate at different rates and can be stored for different amounts of time. And so site condition is really, really important. This is an example of kind of the poster child of soil carbon accumulation, a peat bog. This is an example from, or this is Orono Peat Bog, which is a really cool spot in Maine. If you have a chance to visit, they have a great boardwalk that you can go out into the bog. And so soils with high water tables like bogs, fens can store large amounts of carbon, really because that lack of oxygen. So it's an environment with a water table that depletes the oxygen, slows decomposition. And so you get this buildup of organic matter, which is peat. And so peat bogs are known to be the places that store the highest amounts of soil carbon of any terrestrial ecosystem. Some examples are, you know, 10, 20 feet deep. It's important to recognize this is something that is a theme I talk about a lot about carbon. Is it even though carbon can potentially be stored in the soil for hundreds of thousands of years, carbon is really dynamic. It is the basis of energy source for all parts of the forest. And so on an ongoing basis, there's both carbon inputs and there's also carbon losses from a forest system and from soil. And this is very natural and important for the processes and all the biodiversity that depends on carbon. And so many factors impact that balance, including things like soil, texture, soil type, the site conditions, the vegetation. And of course, then there's some decisions that we make when we're stewarding and managing forests that can affect these processes too. So you have carbon inputs. I've talked about that input of detritus, exudates, leachates that are coming into the soil. And then you also have carbon losses. And these losses happen as organisms decompose that organic matter. I talked about leaching. So when those carbon components become soluble in water, and we have a big rain event or just naturally with streams flowing downhill, and that carbon will end up down in bigger streams and rivers, down in lakes and ponds. When we have soil erosion, that carbon does get exported as soil in water, as particles. And it's not a loss per se. It's getting transported. It's a lateral flow, but it is a loss from that forest. And it's really important for us to think about how can we keep as much carbon in the soil where it is. We also have carbon losses from combustion, so fire. When we have forest fires, especially in our neck of the woods, a lot of forest fires do smolder underground, and that's what they're burning is that organic layer and leaf litter layer. And then we also have just this process called respiration, and it's similar to how we respire in that all plants and all other organisms are using um, uh, carbon molecules for their energy source. And in that process, they actually release carbon dioxide back out into the atmosphere. And so we have these two terms we use, carbon sink, net absorber of carbon dioxide. This is when those gains, those inputs are bigger than those losses. And then a carbon source is when those losses are bigger than gains. So it's really this balance between those two elements. And I will say that this can be transient. There's a time when a soil or a forest can be a carbon source and maybe a carbon sink later. And that happens naturally in our ecosystem because of our seasons. We often see that soils can be a carbon source when there aren't as many inputs and we have lots of decomposition, respiration, or erosion processes happening. And so that could be transient over time. Carbon can be lost from the soil a number of ways, as I talked about. So this physical loss and chemical loss. So physical, is easier to visualize. Water, wind, erosive forces carry that carbon off site. That's an example from my town, my road, where we had a July storm this past year, and an immense amount of soil erosion happened. And, that's a lot of carbon in that soil that gets exported downhill. I mentioned combustion of this organic matter during a fire, metabolic processes that are like respiration of anything that lives in the soil, as well as living roots. So those are the main components of how we have soil loss. But soil carbon loss can also occur when we impact that soil with machinery, vehicles, or even foot traffic, right? Thinking of hiking trails. Anytime we cause soil rutting and compaction, we can degrade the soil structure and cause erosion. And one of the things about impacts like this is actually it pushes those air um, air pockets out of soil when we have heavy equipment on. And wet soils are more prone to compaction than dry soils. And so what we see is when we push that air out of the soil, we actually have a situation where we can have methane production in that soil. And methane is also a greenhouse gas and very potent. And what happens also when we have lack of oxygen in the soil is in compaction is it means that future plant growth in that area might be constrained. And you see this sometimes on old trails, old forest roads, and there aren't any plants growing on them. Likely that soil has been compacted, and it will take some rejuvenation to allow plant roots to be able to penetrate that soil. I get a lot of questions about earthworms and how they affect soil carbon. I will say it's a complex and growing area of research, but for folks that aren't aware, all earthworms, we have here in the Northeast are not native. We have European origin earthworms and some newer earthworms that originated from places in Asia, and they've all been introduced usually for fishing bait or more, or sometimes they get inadvertently introduced through the horticultural trade. And this is an example of a forest soil that has earthworms. You can see all these little balls of soil, and that's a really classic example of evidence of earthworms. Looks like coffee grounds. And there has been some work looking into earthworms and carbon. And it's complex in that in many places, the carbon actually gets translocated deeper in the soil profile. But one source of research we had here in Vermont looked at locations where there were different amounts of earthworms, and they're just looking in this forest floor. So that's a top level of, above the soil where you have leaf litter and twigs. And they did see that locations where they had higher earthworm density, they had less carbon in that forest floor layer. So that's on that axis on the left, and these are different sites with the green bars showing places with higher earthworm density. So we do see that earthworms churn through that forest floor, that leaf litter layer, and reduce the amount of carbon. That said, some of that carbon, it does seem like just goes further into the soil profile, so more research is needed to understand that dynamic. We do know soil carbon varies by forest type, and these are two examples showing soil carbon storage on the left graph. And what this shows is stand age, and these are modeled examples. So these are sort of to illustrate differences between forest types. Forest stand age is on the bottom axis, and it just goes to 125 years. We certainly know they're older forests than that of these types, but this is just to show these generalized processes. And what you'll see is spruce balsam fir, which is in that sort of weird tan color at the top, stores the most carbon in the soil. And this makes sense if you think about being in a spruce fir forest. If you get on your knees and look at the soil in the forest floor, it has a lot of needles from those trees. And those needles take a long time to decompose. They're actually very resistant to decomposition. They're also very cold sort of places, usually where those species exist. And so they have a short growing season. That limits the amount of decomposition that happens over a year. And then you look at the other spectrum, the bottom line, oak hickory, generally warmer sites, particularly hickory foliage gets decomposed really quickly. And so you actually don't see as much accumulation of soil carbon in those types of forests. Again, this really can vary based on the specific site, but just to give you some generalized ideas about this, when we look at carbon flux, so this is carbon accumulation, and bigger negative numbers show more accumulation over time. We see again similar patterns in that spruce balsam fir forest type has more accumulation. But this general trend of a lot of that accumulation happens early in stand development. And this makes sense because when you think about a younger forest, they're building up that soil profile. And then as that forest stand ages, what we see is the carbon in the soil generally becomes at a level where it's close to equilibrium. Of course, there's going to be fluctuations and there's still accumulation over time, but that's a general trend we see. Lots of folks are interested in how forest management affects soil carbon. And what we see from these really big studies, a lot of the work I'll show here is by Luke Nave, who is a soil scientist for the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. And he's done what we call meta-analyses. So these are looking at the available research on soil carbon and putting those all together into one big research project. And so what we see here in the graph on the right is those numbers by all the bars are the numbers of studies that were incorporated into each one of those points. So if we look at the top overall, we see out of 432 studies, we see that there is a small loss in by percentage in soil carbon with forest management. We do see if we bump down to the forest floor and focus on the solid dots, the open dots, there's two ways we can look at carbon. It's by amount and then by concentration. And so there's two different ways scientists look at carbon in soil. So if you look at the solid dots, forest floor, we're seeing the majority of that carbon loss after forest management is in the forest floor. That's the leaf litter area, the twig layer, really right at the surface. When we look at surface mineral soils, the next section below that, we see much smaller losses and then deeper, maybe about 5% losses. That whole soil mineral profile, in fact, can have increases in soil carbon because that carbon just can often get transported deeper into the soil. So the take home from this and conclusions that Luke Nave has made is that really following best management practices. So these are practices to reduce impacts to soil that we have in all of our states. We have, small, somewhat small losses post-harvest, and those losses are going to be more pronounced in the forest floor and upper portion of the soil compared to lower in the soil profile. And this is because those deeper soil horizons are not disturbed, and so soil carbon tends to be more stable in those areas. And remember, I showed earlier that the carbon pool in general gains carbon very slowly. So when we think about the take home from this is the most important thing we can do when we're managing a forest and managing soil carbon is to avoid losses. That forest floor component, it's really important, and that's where we see the biggest impacts from forest management, but it is a small percent of the total forest carbon we see in our forest. So again, looking at this is the same pie chart I showed earlier when I was pointing out the soil carbon that stores more than half of the carbon in our forest. Then if we look at that yellow bar there, that's the forest floor. And that's about 6% of the total carbon in our forests. It does vary by forest type, as we see in this bar chart on the right. So, spruce, balsam fir, again, has the most carbon stored in that forest floor pool, as well as the soil pool I showed earlier. And then oak hickory is the least. So those really do mirror the soil as well as in the forest floor. And why do we see these losses or these changes in carbon in the soil? It really has to do with after harvest, there is less organic matter inputs and a higher rate of decomposition. And so when we think about timber management, we're opening up the stand, we're creating a different microclimate. And so usually there's less fine root turnover because we've removed some of the trees from the site. There's less above ground litter, and those root exudates I mentioned that live trees are actually releasing carbon compounds into the soil, those decline too. When we remove the tree canopy, there's more sunlight that reaches the forest floor. So we do see in many cases, it depends on site and aspect, that the soil temperature will increase after that. Those warmer soil conditions do stimulate the activity of that soil biota. And so, generally rule of thumb, the more trees that are removed, the larger reduction we see in organic matter inputs post-harvest. And remember that seaside showed you that really it's a balance between organic matter inputs and outputs is where we get that sort of change in soil carbon over time. So that we can take some of those principles to think about, the magnitude of soil carbon loss with harvesting. And we see that there are differences depending on how much residue, how much dead wood we leave on site. And this is another research paper, meta-analysis by Luke Nave here. And this is showing percent change in carbon storage again. And the top point and bar shows that when we have logs only have been harvested from the site compared to residues. So that's when we remove, all the branches, limbs from the site. We do have slightly bigger percent change in carbon storage from that. And those two bars at the top are in the O horizon. That's the organic horizon, that top layer of the soil. If we bump down and look at the difference between logs and residues in the A horizon, that's one horizon below the organic layer. It's more minerally. We see a smaller change in carbon storage after harvest. But again, that kind of similar trend that we have bigger changes in carbon storage when all residues are removed. So, another take home from this, and I'll talk about, is leaving some residues, leaving tops and limbs, maybe even increasing the amount of dead wood on site to enhance that soil carbon component. There's also been a study in New Hampshire that looked at differences in soil carbon by different magnitudes of timber harvesting, and they named them low, moderate, and high timber harvesting. That sort of relates to like the number of trees removed in an area, and they compared it to a control. And these different colors in the bars are different depths, and apologies for them being in centimeters, but it's actually reversed. So the top lightest color is the deepest depth. And if you look at the bottom darkest red color, that's the surface layer. And so what we can take from this, there actually was no statistical difference in this amount of carbon based on these different types of treatments, silvicultural treatments. But, generally we see that clear cutting, so the high intensity timber harvesting resulted in greater losses of soil carbon. And that partial harvest, so that low and really moderate types of removal were very similar to the control. And so we can, conclude that partial harvest especially when we have areas of retention, so leaving individual trees or patches of trees, really might have short-lived or really undetectable declines in soil carbon. One place where we do see impacts are landings and roads. And this makes sense. I talked about earlier compaction that we get when we push the oxygen out of the soil that can create methane emissions, can also limit root growth. What we also see in log landings is we get mixture and burial of some wood matter. It just happens, right? We have limbs and things like that get run over. And when we bury those pieces of wood, we again get methane emissions because we've sort of pushed all the oxygen out and we create an environment where methane is the emission from all the organisms that are decomposing that wood. And so we see from some work that looked at differences, basically you're seeing this is methane emissions, which is CH4 instead of CO2 is the how we denote it. And you'll see in those darker bars, the blue and the dark bars are places where there were log landings compared to the control, which is the unfilled or white bars. And you see we get more methane emissions in those locations. And really summer is the biggest time when we see those emissions, but it does happen in both the other seasons. I will say though, when we think about carbon and soil, we know that other impacts to the land like deforestation, forest loss, as well as fire have huge implications to soil carbon compared to harvesting. And so this is, important when we think about our New England and New York landscape where we are having land conversion happening throughout. So we see again, both Luke Nave research here. Again, he's done the bulk of the work here. These are analyses again, where he compiles data from a lot of different studies, showing on the left example of change in soil carbon storage in percent harvest. Then you see land use change and fire, right? And those have much bigger carbon losses, which makes sense. Land use change, you're not only cutting all the trees, removing the live biomass, you're often disturbing that soil through excavation, trenching, digging foundations, compaction, etc. And fire is burning a lot of that biomass. Of course, fire is natural in many ecosystems, but it is something to keep in mind. And then when we look at on the other side, on the right image, is showing deforestation. On the bottom of that graph, you see development, and agriculture is actually a bigger carbon loss compared to forest than development. And so that's something, is important to recognize. This study showed no significant, change in carbon stock, carbon storage, and forest harvesting. And then when we reforest areas, so when we actually allow trees to reforest naturally or replant trees, we actually get huge increases in soil carbon, which is pretty exciting to recognize. We can rejuvenate and renovate these areas. What will climate change mean for forest soil carbon? It's really uncertain. So we could see possible soil carbon losses. For example, if we continue to see warmer winters, we will have more time for decomposition. Right now, it's pretty warm where I am in northern Vermont. That means the soil biota is active, but the trees do not have leaves on them. They're not sequestering carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And we'll see that these times of years we have more soil respiration, more losses than we do gains. Certainly things like heavy rainfall events can increase soil erosion. Saturated soils that we get in those events can actually increase methane emissions. So when soils stay saturated for long periods of time, that can happen. And of course, if we saw more forest fires, we could have more carbon emissions. We could see possible losses or gains depending on changes in forest growth and tree growth, as well as health. We are seeing in some locations that trees are growing better because there's a longer growing season. There's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. However, we also are seeing events that affect forest health, like this photo is an example in southern Vermont where we have mortality of hemlock trees from hemlock woolly adelgid. That, of course, will change the carbon dynamics, not only in the above ground portion of that forest, but also in the soil. And so we could see changes in root turnover, the amount of live root exudates, organic matter inputs. Potentially, we could see changes in species distributions, where species exist. And so how that changes soil carbon is unclear and uncertain right now. So let's talk about some things we can do to prevent soil carbon losses. Really, the big take homes here are to seek to minimize disturbances caused by water runoff, equipment, vehicles, tilling, excavation, anything that causes physical impacts to the soil. So examples, always a good practice to maintain vegetation adjacent to any water bodies, and this helps reduce export of soil and its carbon into those water bodies. Using water diversion structures on roads and trails to minimize erosion, and keeping water on site. We use this phrase, slow spread sink water, rather than channelize. And I will say there's some great work from Steve Roberge at UNH Extension talking about extreme BMPs for heavy rain events. So think, not expecting, even if your site has never experienced road washouts, culvert issues, that might not hold in the future. Thinking about laying out roads and trails to avoid steep slopes and allow for their future reuse. So really being strategic about where we have impacts, and restricting equipment, of course, as possible when soils are frozen and dry. Where that's not possible, using structures like bridges, corduroy, branches spread across this traveled surface to reduce impacts to the soil. And just thinking really, thoughtfully about how to minimize and concentrate areas of disturbance. So here are some examples of using, logs and branches to reduce soil disturbance, thinking about closing out any unused legacy roads and trails. This is a pervasive problem we have, across our region, that there's roads that were put in places that they probably shouldn't have, 50, 100 years ago, and they've become channels for water. So thinking about ways to slow down that water movement and reduce soil erosion. One strategy we can use is called contour felling. It's hard to tell. That's why I put the little arrow to show you this is a slope. But really thinking about strategically laying down trees that, are not something economically worthwhile to take out of the woods. This is, a fairly easy practice you can do, and putting them perpendicular to the slope. And what they do, and we see this naturally happen in the woods, is they act as little dams to stop the flow of water. And you can see they collect leaf litter, organic matter, twigs, soil, etc. And that can be really, really, really helpful in keeping material on site. I will say that there are some cases where strategic forest floor and soil disturbance may be beneficial to long-term resilience goals. And so this is just something, I really say, like, there's no one size fits all approach. Using the principles of ecology to inform management is great, but there's also site conditions that might dictate something different. And this is an example of a site in Vermont, in Groton, where the understory was all beach sprouts from beach bark disease. And so they, in coordination with Tony D'Amato at the University of Vermont, decided to do something a little bit more drastic to see the outcomes, to get some species diversity and complexity on the site. And so soil scarification can be used as a way to promote regeneration of certain tree species. And so, yes, we know it will result in temporary soil carbon losses, but for thinking about this outcome of resilience and regeneration is a key component of resilience, as well as species diversity in that regeneration layer. This can be a worthwhile outcome. And so, it's really weighing the trade-offs from those decisions. So we can also think about promoting soil and forest floor carbon through a couple of different strategies, and these all have additional ecological benefits. So I mentioned already, when you're harvesting timber, leave some branches and tops from harvested trees. Rule of thumb is, at least a third. And there's some other beneficial outcomes from leaving those limbs. It can help reduce deer browse, provide sites for wildlife. Manage or encourage establishment of a new cohort of trees, or only remove that overstory if there is advanced regeneration. So it's really important to be thinking about having things underneath that are growing and can take over and provide those continued carbon benefits. We can think about creating more deadwood through this process of morticulture, right? We have silviculture and now we have morticulture. I talked about contour felling, but there's some other strategies we can do. I'll show you in a couple slides. We can use strategies with our management to increase species diversity, and what we call forest structural complexity just means having trees of a greater range of sizes and heights, and having a non-uniform canopy. So we want gaps in the canopy, we want complexity, and we know that that's great for carbon. Retaining clumps or individual trees in harvest area, so having retention. Again, this allows for that continuity of carbon processes with the below ground soil biota. It also, retention provides a seed source for regeneration as well. And thinking about promoting adaptation to climate change, so that means things like encouraging tree species that might be better adapted to the future climate of your site. So things, red oak is usually, pulled out as a poster child of that, but seeing if promoting red oak in a forest and having that as a diversity component, but it also means that that site might be better situated to drought events and to hot conditions. So some examples of deadwood, leaving tops and limbs, as I mentioned, chop and drop. So we can do this with low value trees, is just chopping them and leaving them where they are. Girdling is a practice that some folks are doing. I will say just make sure it's in a place where it's safe to do so. So away from trails and roads, in a place where you're not going to come back for, 5 to 10 years. And you just cut, not fully through the stem. Cutting usually two concentric circles. And that tree will slowly die, and be future deadwood. And the last strategies I wanted to talk about is sort of these other things we can do that are really, really important. So the first, this is something I talk about a lot for all attributes of forest, is all that we can do to keep forests as forests. And so we do know, we look at, forest land conversion to other land types, we will have less carbon benefits in the above ground portion, but certainly in the forest floor and soil components. And so it's really, really critical that we think about ways we keep forests as forests, whether they're working, whether they're passively managed. They provide those critical benefits. We can create more forests too by, allowing once forested areas to regrow naturally. And this has happened in our region just from, folks abandoning certain areas. If it's not used for something else, trees will naturally come back. That's sort of our most dominant land cover. And then we can also plant new trees, being thoughtful about where we plant those, what we plant. But even, in people's yards, adding some new trees as, hedgerows, as windbreaks along cropland. That's a great way to build soil carbon. So just summary take-home points. So in our forests, soils store more than half of the carbon. That does vary by forest type, site characteristics, and of course that land use history. Building soil carbon takes time, but depleting it can happen more quickly. So in general, if that soil is not physically disturbed during active forest management, soil carbon losses are pretty small. They are mostly be in that top layer, that forest floor layer, and those deeper layers are generally protected. And there are actions we can use to further protect soil carbon, examples of, avoiding forest conversion, limiting soil disturbance, being really thoughtful with our road layout. And there are also actions we can take to enhance soil carbon, like adding more deadwood, allowing areas to regenerate, promoting diversity and complexity, and adaptation to climate change. And so I'll just end with a QR code. This is the UVM Extension Forestry website that I created and maintain, and I have resources for folks. I also have a YouTube channel that has various webinars and presentations on a range of topics. There's a whole channel just on carbon as well as climate change. And I do have this guide to forest carbon in the Northeast. There's the second chapter in it is all about soil carbon. A lot of the information from this presentation is from there, but it will go in a little bit more deeper, and that's freely available as a PDF. There are also hard copies that are available, including in New York State. Molly Hassett at the state of New York has a lot of copies. And so if you need anything, I'm always happy to hear from folks. My email is at the top, but I will open it to questions.
Great job, Allie. Thank you very much. And there's a lot of good kind of sidebar conversation going on,
Okay.
which is always, I mean, that's like the fun part, I think, of
Yeah.
webinars is that people can interact in ways that they typically couldn't. Um, so I'll let you. So there was
Oh
a
gosh, there's a
series.
lot of questions. I don't even know where to start.
So scroll to the top.
Okay.
And I think I added the link
Oh,
that you
great.
had given
Perfect.
for
Yeah.
the guide to forest carbon. So the PDF is there. And then Jeremy starts with questions at the 12:12 timestamp.
Yeah.
So some of those are like exchanges between people and some are questions for you.
Yeah.
So and,
All right. I'll just sort of work through them as I,
yep.
so first question I see is great one. I don't know the answer is how long does it take for leaf litter to create 1 inch of organic soil? I'm gonna have to look this up. I've heard anywhere from 500 to 2,000 years. Wow. I would think it's actually less than that here. I showed early in the presentation by forest type that storage and then sequestration or accumulation of soil carbon. And we see that the bulk of that building of soil carbon happens when our forests are in a sort of what we'd call like a young to early age stand. For us, it would be, for humans, it's sort of middle age. So that like 20 to 60, 70-year-old range is when we see the bulk of accumulation. That's true for above ground portions because really trees are putting on a ton of biomass. They're growing tall. They're putting on big root systems. And there's that the soil is also accumulating carbon at that time. It's building up. The soil biotic community is building. And so, I don't know. And I also would think that question really depends on climate, forest type, soil. So there's a lot of variability, but I would actually think that it would happen faster than that in our forest just based on that accumulation figure I showed you. But I might poke around to see if there are any estimates. I don't know. It's a tough one. Great question, though. Oh, okay. Someone asked about the place in Maine I mentioned. So that's Orono Bog. It's managed by the University of Maine in Orono, Maine. And I think it's just called Orono Bog.
So
Trying to
we so both I and David Lugwood
Oh,
put
put
links in
a
there. So
yeah, and
right.
there's a
So
great they did this beautiful bog walk. It's so cool, and they have exceptional informational displays that are very captivating and scientific because you walk through different ecosystems. Sort of have a floodplain forest, and then the conditions change. It gets really acidic, and you have stunted larch trees and black spruce, and then there's even pitcher plants in there. So those are um, they what do you call it? Carnivorous
carnivorous,
plant,
right?
which is pretty cool. And so it's very, very neat. Highly recommend. So thanks for question about sphagnum. Mosses are mosses in a forest efficient in storing carbon? Um, you know, So the reason, sphagnum is really good at storing carbon because it's actually dead moss that accumulates over time. It accumulates faster than it breaks down, and so that's really why that's such a great uh, carbon storage mechanism. In our forest, we do have a lot of mosses, but they're contributing to that, as they die or as parts of them break off, they will contribute to the organic matter in the soil. But I can't imagine that an individual moss, just because its size, is storing much carbon. Really, that carbon component comes from that accumulation of that dead plant matter over time. And I will say this is, a thing we see like permafrost, right? Up in Arctic areas. It's accumulation of old biomass, old plant matter that because it's so cold, the decomposition happens very slowly, super short growing season, right? So you get more accumulation over, millennia than there is decomposition. What we're seeing as the climate is warming, we're seeing those areas are warming up. And so actually they're emitting a lot of that carbon. The decomposition is speeding up. The soil biotic community is becoming more active. And so that is a concern as we see the climate change in places where we do have massive amounts of carbon stored in the soil because of cold climates are seeing changes. Question about loamy soils storing intermediate amount of carbon since they're between sand and clays. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good assumption. I mean, clay is really, it has chemical properties that bind to different components, and carbon is one of them. Sand just doesn't have that same chemical property. And so most soils have some sort of mixture of silt, sand and clay. And so that variability can depend, and that will depend on what soil profile layer you're in as well. So there's a question about any studies specifically addressing the impacts of wildfire or prescribed fire on soil carbon in Northeast forests, pine barrens, shrublands, or grasslands. I know that there is research on this. Whether there's research from our neck of the woods, I don't know, but one webinar I would highly recommend, and we could send out the link to this, is Adrian Keller, who is a coworker, talked a lot about Luke Nave at NIACS, Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. She's also a soil carbon specialist, and she did a webinar maybe a couple months ago on soil carbon and fire. So really interesting. It comes a little bit more. She's out in the Midwest, but we have similar forest types. There's a lot of applicability to that. So that would be a good resource to check out. Yeah, so there is like more technical question Mara has about bulk soil carbon measurements. Yes, those are versus soil carbon fractions. So this is sort of getting into technical weeds about how soil scientists measure carbon. There's sort of different ways to think about it. And one of those figures showed from Luke sort of distinguish between that. But there is like it gets complex and like actually how do we measure carbon in a soil in soil because it depends on how heavy it is, all these other components of soil. And so that does there, you can poke around in some of those resources more and see how Luke has described that. So working through the questions here.
So those, I
Um,
think that the Allie, the
Go ahead.
questions from Mara and Elizabeth, I think came. You're showing graphs that show the different forest types, and
Yes,
those were about the same time. So I'm assuming that those
about the
questions.
aspen birch type.
Yes, yep. So it's showing
Yep.
the different forest types.
Yes. So how can that have, it, so there's a combination. I'm talking about like I'm showing examples of forest types, but we know different species exist on different soils. So to suss say forest type, I'm sort of, it's sort of simplifying the fact that we know that different species exist on different soils, types, nutrient concentrations, nutrient content, water availability. And so that's all tied into it. Aspen birch types of forests, we just see that that's sort of the trend for their soil carbon. And it likely has to do, I'd have to dig into some of the research on that. It's not like I mostly focus on northern hardwood forests and spruce fir forests. But it just has to do with how that carbon gets cycled into that soil component. A question about the relative importance of exudates from living plants or fungi as inputs in soil carbon versus dead organic matter. That is a great question. And what's really interesting about soils and soil carbon is our understanding of them is growing so fast. And in fact, that exact question is one that only recently has sort of been elevated. It used to be thought that it was primarily dead organic matter is the way that carbon got into soil. And now we realize that these exudates from living roots and mycorrhizal fungi are really, really critical. And maybe around 50% of the carbon that gets into soil could come from those sources. And so it's really changed the way we think about soil carbon. And there's folks that are really researching that and trying to figure out, how does that vary by forest type, by stand age, by all these other factors that we have. But it is a really big component and had been overlooked for a long period of time. Um, Question about winter was not a category and timing of harvest. I think that was for the log landings question.
Yes, yep.
I think they just didn't look at winter because it's harder to measure soil carbon dioxide emissions in winter because you have snowpack. So it gets a little bit harder. When we do have frozen soils, mostly the soil biota is dormant as well is the plants and the trees. And so less is going on. Of course, we get, January thaws and really, warm winters like we're having right now. And so that can change. But, I think that was probably the reasoning behind that research is to look in times when you could actually measure the soil and what's coming out of it. Yeah, someone had a good comment about stored carbon being in the form of charred biomass. So we now call that, people call that biochar. And indigenous communities and cultures have used that for a long, long period of time, not for the carbon storage, but for its nutrient qualities. So as a soil amendment, we know that biochar binds to lots of nutrients. It actually can be used to help restore soils by combining things like heavy metals and phosphorus and all sorts of cool applications like that. And so it's a really long term way to store carbon in a soil. And, if you go into a forest where fire is a part of the system, you can find, I mean, I found it like near trees, you find little pieces of charcoal, and it can be from a fire that happened there, 100 years ago or more. Um, Oh, great. Someone posted, oh no, Peter, you posted the BMP webinar. Great. People are posting lots of great resources. Um, Someone did ask about biochar as a way, sort of a product, and it is increasing in interest. There are a few outfits that are looking into producing biochar. And actually, I was down in the Southern Appalachians this spring in North Carolina, and they're actually doing some biochar creation from on federal forest lands, and they're actually putting it back into the log landings as a way. I talked about the compaction and sort of issues there, and so they're using that as a way to aerate and amend that soil in those log landings, which I thought was a really cool application. They're doing a lot of that work to reduce forest fire risk, so it has this like really great combined outcomes there. But it is a challenge. It's not something we've done a lot of. Okay. Yes, great. Shout out to UVM men's soccer team. That's great. Thank you. Yeah, and someone asked about links to the PDF. I think, yeah, Peter can share, happy to share the PDF of the talk, and all that kind of stuff. So great resources. There's a question about soil carbon sequestration in forests and grasslands. I'm not a grassland expert, and I couldn't tell you, but native grasslands, I do know can have very, very deep and robust root systems. The issue is, some grass systems that we have in the United States are non-native grasses. They often have shallower root systems. I still think, let me look at that figure I had at the end of the presentation, conversion that showed conversion of forest land to grassland. We do still see a decrease in soil carbon from that conversion. That's a very generalized assessment over a lot of different studies, but we do see that trend, even though grasslands are really important for a lot of different reasons too. And that sort of gets to a general point I like to make is that carbon is one of the many services we have in our forests and our ecosystems. It's not the only service, and so we shouldn't just solely focus on managing for that outcome. There's a lot of other reasons why we might want to have other types of ecosystems that are natural and support different wildlife and biodiversity goals. All right. Okay. There's still lots. I don't think I can keep up with all these, Peter. It's a lot in here.
They're an engaged
Yeah, it's
audience.
great. I appreciate it.
So Ali mentioned a few resources and had the final slide of her presentation on the YouTube channel, the booklet that Joan was asking about managing forests with climate change in mind, and then the
Yes.
Northeast Forest Car. I'll get those and I'll send
Yep.
that to everybody who registered for this webinar.
Yep. Great. Yeah, and there is a question about climate smart forest management. I focus on that too. I see these as two sides of the same coin. Climate change impacts the forest and how can we steward them with climate change in mind, and carbon benefits, right? We need all of these services, and we have to think about the impacts of climate change on our forests to have carbon benefits in the future. And so I do have resources, as Peter mentioned. I have that 12 steps to managing your forest with climate change in mind, but also lots of webinars. They hit a range of audiences, really introductory, and they have more technical ones, maybe for like a forester professional audience. So those are on my YouTube channel. And there's lots of other ones, I'm sure, with the Forest Connect series as well, and other resources out there. Great. I think that's good. Hopefully I got to every, if you had a question I didn't get to as I scrolled through all of those, feel free to email me. I'm happy to see if I can answer the question.
Ali, thank you so much. This was a great presentation.
Great.
Obviously, people had a lot of fun with it, and it stimulated a lot of thinking and a lot of inquiry for future information. So
Great.
I appreciate it, and on their behalf, they appreciated it. So
Yeah.
Ali
Thanks,
will be
everyone.
Ali will be back at 7 o'clock if you
Yeah.
want to see it again.
Yeah. Right.
All
All
right.
right.
Thanks,
Take
everybody.
care. See you
Yes.
later.